This is a message of thanks and gratitude to all you amazing Reluctant Preppers who are making Reluctant Preppers possible by supporting our mission on Patreon. With your help, we're overcoming a 75% drop in YouTube earnings because you're not standing still, but are doing something about it and taking action by going to patreon.com/reluctantpreppers and pledging to keep us on the air. Now our team is 42 patrons strong and growing. And when we reach 100 patrons, we'll start sending out tokens of gratitude as a handwritten note from your host, Dunnigan Kaiser, and an autograph signed on a U.S. Silver Eagle to one of our patrons selected at random each and every month. If you haven't yet taken the step of joining in to support Reluctant Preppers, it's so easy. Just go to patreon.com/reluctantpreppers and pledge any amount you can. You guys are awesome, and we can do this together with your help at patreon.com/reluctantpreppers. Did you know you can buy silver at spot price? Get your 10-ounce bar of silver at spot price today. Go to sdbullion.com/RP. Not only will you be buying silver without any premium, you'll also be supporting the independent media. Reluctant Preppers gets a small commission when you take advantage of this special offer, going to sdbullion.com/RP. That's sdbullion.com/RP. Hey everyone, thanks for joining us here on Reluctant Preppers. Asking for your help tonight because even though we have record numbers of subscribers here on Reluctant Preppers trying to spread the word about preparedness and self-reliance and awareness, we've been receiving reduced revenue from our YouTube videos being marked as advertiser unfriendly and having to curtail the content and the descriptions and the topics and the guests that we can introduce. So with your help, we can overcome that and break free of that restriction. If you go to patreon.com/reluctantpreppers, you can make any amount of small or modest or larger monthly donation to help support our mission. We've established goals there to help bring you even more content with the different levels that we can achieve together. Thanks, folks. Check it out, patreon.com/reluctantpreppers. And now, on to our main event.
As a responsible person with growing concerns for your privacy and personal liberty, you want to know where we're headed and what you can do about it. We ask the experts what you need to do to take prudent and responsible action to safeguard your family's wealth and well-being, and what basic first steps will help you to be aware and prepared. ReluctantPreppers.com.
Welcome back, Reluctant Preppers. We have a distinguished returning guest tonight, Dr. Arthur T. Bradley. He is a NASA engineer and scientist. He's the author of 14 books dealing with emergency survival and collapse, including The Handbook to Practical Disaster Preparedness for the Family, Disaster Preparedness for EMP Attacks and Solar Storms, and the Prepper's Instruction Manual, 50 Steps to Prepare for Any Disaster. He has a blog at disasterpreparer.com, and he's here with us again on Reluctant Preppers. Dr. Bradley, thank you for joining us once again.
Sure, thank you for having me on.
We wanted to discuss a recent article that you published about now is the time to start paying attention to the threats that could lead us to World War III, but in any case should result in people seriously looking at their preparedness and their vulnerability to a potential global social political upset. If you could tell us about why this got your attention. We've certainly seen a lot of news stories about saber-rattling going on recently in different hotspots around the world, but what particularly grabbed your attention at this time?
Yeah, I think the time is sort of right for a conflict with North Korea. We've certainly seen a lot of, as you said, saber-rattling between both Kim Jong-un and President Trump. And I think we're at a unique position where I think both of these leaders are at a place where they want to sort of exert their authority and show themselves to be strong leaders. And that's oftentimes how conflicts start. Neither one, wants to be seen as weak. And so you have a situation here where you have, two very powerful militaries and two very powerful personalities that are just sort of looking to butt heads. One of the things that, I think people underestimate is the willingness of North Korea to actually engage the United States in a military conflict. You have to remember that Kim Jong-un doesn't run his country the same way the United States does. He doesn't have to have the popularity of his people or any of that. And so I think he's really looking, in my opinion, I think he's really looking for a fight, a brief fight, a fight that might, let him come out the other side with maybe a few war wounds, but show that he could stand up to one of the greatest world powers and still come out the other side. And I think that's the danger facing us right now.
And in that kind of a conflict, what are some of the scenarios that you took some time to lay out that could affect people both from our extending our power abroad, as well as things that could come back effects nearer to shore?
Yeah, so I think what we as Americans, we have conflicts of one sort or another. We're sort of imperialistic in that way. We have conflicts in one sort or another, and have for many, many years, including on the Korean Peninsula. But I think what's happening right now is that people have become so accustomed to that. We almost sort of tune it out, right? We hear of there's a conflict in Iraq or conflict in Afghanistan, and it doesn't really feel personal, because we're not engaged in that battle. At least many of us are not. Now, certainly some of our children are overseas fighting, but we have a detachment from it, I think. And I think this conflict with North Korea has the ability to be something very different than that. North Korea has a fairly large army of various sorts, and I put in this newsletter that I sent out just some estimates and facts that I pulled off the web, and I'm not a North Korean military expert. I don't think anybody really knows what they have, but I think there's some reasonable estimates out there, and just to sort of put it in context of the enemy we're facing, I think is important. So, it's estimated that they have perhaps over 900 aircraft. Well, they're not going to stand up to our modern-day aircraft, but it doesn't mean they can't cause harm, as well as many, many, many thousands of artillery pieces and, air defense guns, and they have we have about 700,000 active duty and more than 4 million reservists. Again, now we've learned from other battles that, when push comes to shove, a lot of people turn and run when they're facing a superior opponent. But again, this is a different kind of entity, right? These aren't people that necessarily maybe even feel they can turn and run, short of losing their own lives anyway. So, and they have submarines and naval vessels and lots of things. But what I wanted to draw people's attention to is, they also have, as we know, they're developing, a nuclear program, and they have certainly demonstrated themselves capable of detonating a nuclear warhead. And they also have huge arsenals of chemical and biological weapons. So there's some of the leaders in the world, in fact, of stockpiling these horrible weapons, everything from sarin gas to, the plague, for example. And so I'm only setting the stage of what the enemy is that we face. This is not a conventional enemy, and they wouldn't fight like a conventional enemy. And so what I tell people is that when, as we go to assess what our threats are here in the mainland United States, you have to think about first, what is my enemy out there and how is he thinking? So that's sort of the description of the enemy. Now, how is he thinking? I think people need to realize that this is not a leader who in any way would try and engage the United States in a front-on-face attack, right? He knows he's not going to win that war. Instead, this is an intelligent military machine that's had a few decades now to prepare for a battle with the United States, and they're not going to fight a conventional war. So as we talk about impacts to the U.S., I think everybody ought to think about that. Put on the nastiest hats you can think of and think about what you would do in his shoes if you really wanted to cause some kind of mayhem. And I think then you start getting in his mindset.
You mentioned in your article some specific scenarios. Do you want to go ahead and pose a few that people might want to consider and how they could affect us both? Not only, any serious conflict that our country would be involved in affects us morally, and it affects our relationship with other countries around the world. And that can play out through generations, but it also affects us economically, and it can also affect us directly and domestically. Can you just run through a few of the scenarios and how those might play out?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So as we go, I sat down for 30 minutes and I put on my nasty hat and I said, well, if I were him, what would I do to essentially win this battle, win this conflict with the United States? Now, understand, he's not he would not be thinking in any mind that he would defeat the entire United States. What he needs to do is cause enough disruption to the world that our allies essentially put pressure on the United States to back off, right? That he's causing so much damage and mayhem to the world that we're better off dealing with him in another way. That would be his ultimate goal. And if he could succeed in that, if we engaged in a conflict and we ultimately backed off short of completely defeating him, he would have won. No doubt about it, he would have won. And forever he would be known as sort of the man who stood up to the United States and managed to come away from it. So I sat down for 30 minutes and said, well, how would I do that if I were in his shoes and I had sort of his arsenal at my disposal? What kind of things could I come up with? And here, I'll just give you a few of mine. Certainly, everybody talks about the massive attack he could bring upon Seoul or even upon Tokyo. two very important institutions to the United States, close allies, financial districts, huge impacts financially, I think, as well as a great loss of life. So certainly those two he could bring, devastating effects upon, including perhaps nuclear weapons upon them. And so conventional,
Dr.
biological...
Bradley, let me interrupt for a second. We just had a power outage where I am. I just need to make sure everything's okay here. Looks like I'm okay.
Okay,
the
sure.
network's okay on battery backup, but let me just see how everything is. I'll be right back. Well, we interrupted our broadcast here because we actually had a complete power failure in the middle of a thunderstorm here, and all our lights are out. Our internet, our laptops are still running on battery. Our internet router is still working on battery backup, and my wife was alerting me to some loud sounds. One was the alarm from our large battery backup on our larger computer. Also downstairs in our basement, we have a backup water-powered sump pump. So because our electric sump pump is out, but a water-powered sump pump kicked in, and that makes, and the check valve and everything makes a big loud sound. So actually, we're pretty stable at the moment as long as our battery backups hold out on our router, so we can continue. But I just wanted people to know some of the backup provisions we had put in place. Looks like they're actually helping us through this outage. Who knows how long it'll last? So, all right. So I interrupted you. You talked about North Korea's nuclear capability was where you were leaving off.
Right. Yeah. First, let me just salute you for being so prepared. Sounds like you're really working it there. That's great. So I'll just pick up and we'll see how far we can get. So I think everybody's aware of the sort of the mainstream attack that North Korea might issue upon Seoul and Tokyo, and I think that's everything that people have talked about that it could be. I don't think it would actually last that long because I think most of the artillery and stuff would be taken out fairly quickly. That's not to say a lot of people wouldn't be displaced or even be killed, but there are many other things that North Korea could do, I think, that might cause the U.S. even more concern. And some of those are things like maybe having agents sneak across into South Korea and deploy dirty bombs, for example, things that are very difficult to undo once they've been done. Or another example is maybe infecting international visitors or their own North Korean people with some kind of disease, let's say maybe the plague, and then having them internationally distributed all around the world to help spread that disease. Again, it can't really be undone once it's done, no matter how powerful we are, and it would cause a lot of fear and chaos, and there would certainly be a great deal of uncertainty that would be felt here, even in the mainland U.S. And then finally, and these are just a few, I have a dozen or so, another one that's very expected is that there would be a widespread cyber attack on U.S. infrastructures, and you're feeling right now what that would be like, which is sort of unexpectedly losing power, but you could also lose perhaps water filtration systems. Nuclear plants could have to be shut down, going into emergency mode. We could lose government services and banking infrastructures and so forth. So, and their cyber capabilities are quite good, as they've proven over the years. They've stolen millions of dollars from banks all around the world, honing these skills. So these are just sort of a few of the many possibilities, of sort of the nasty ways they could cause some chaos and destruction in the world. And that assumes that they don't have any capabilities that we're not fully aware of, like perhaps the ability to deploy an EMP attack on the United States.
And if we could maybe address a couple of these one at a time and say what types of direct impact and indirect impacts that people would be able to make prudent preparedness steps to to mitigate the direct risk to their families.
Sure. So, the method I talk about in my handbook to practical disaster preparedness is, first you start off by asking yourself what it is you're worried about. And in this case, we'd be worried about this conflict with North Korea. The second step is you just say, okay, well, what are the possible impacts of that threat? And that's really what you're talking about. How is it going to affect me if this were to occur? And then finally, well, what steps can I do to help mitigate those impacts on me? And so they're sort of all tied together. Again, I think North Korea's biggest goal of the whole thing would be to cause fear, so that people would put pressure on the United States to back away. Attacks on the U.S. soil would certainly do that, even if they weren't widespread attacks. If there was a submarine that managed to surface and attack the Washington, D.C., and even if it was destroyed very quickly, you can imagine the kind of chaos and fear that would cause. So one of the things I tell people is, recognize the targets, right? And the targets are the hot spots that would gain the most attention, and be away from those, right? Get out of the way. The old cardinal rule of preparedness: if you see it coming, get out of the way. So places like New York City and Washington, D.C., certainly Seoul and Tokyo, places like that, maybe even Hawaii and Guam, you probably don't want to be in those areas should some kind of conflict or war break out with North Korea. The kind of things that we might see here in the continental U.S. is certainly the loss of electrical power, I think, is very likely. There are many ways that North Koreans could attack our electrical grid, cyber attack or otherwise. It's a pretty fragile system. And so we could lose power for some period of time, and that time could be days or even weeks, perhaps. And as you know, being in a blackout, your whole life fundamentally changes pretty quickly. Everything, your capability to do things really diminishes quickly. And some preparations, they do pay off, and you're able to continue functioning to some degree, but it's hard. Life becomes much harder. There are other things that people may lose their ability to earn income. A lot of businesses would be shut down. People don't think about that. Without income, everything starts becoming much more pressured. Without the electricity, a lot of our infrastructures would fall very quickly within days. Grocery stores would have trouble being restocked, and so now you'd have, people who didn't have food storage would become very desperate for emergency rations. Water service could become disrupted. So again, if you weren't prepared for such a thing like that, water is so vital, you can't be without it for even more than a day, really, without everybody really panicking. And on the list goes. If they manage to deploy a weaponized pathogen, let's say they manage to spread the plague in various places across the U.S., you can imagine how everyone would be completely freaked out and trying to stay home and not get out in public and all those kind of things. So, the effects could really be widespread and felt by many people all over the U.S. Now, I do think preparations have a place to help minimize those impacts, and we could talk about those. But I just want everybody to really get a feel for, everything from loss of emergency services to not knowing how to get any communications from the government. Your radio and TVs might not provide anything for you. Cell phone services would go down. We really would be in a state of confusion, if things were done just the right way, where people would not know what was going on.
And so beyond these individual disruptions to people's lives, what are some specific steps? You mentioned about getting out of the way, and you mentioned also having preparedness, like ability to provide water for your family, that sort of thing. What specifically would you identify as like the maybe 1, 2, or 3? Because this can be overwhelming. If people have made either no or modest steps, they think someday I'll get to it. Okay, suddenly this is like happening all around us. What are 1, 2, or 3 things that you think people should really prioritize as the first steps that they should take if they haven't made any yet?
Sure, yeah. So, as you say, preparedness can be very overwhelming. In fact, that's one reason why I wrote the book in the first place was, I started off back in the 9/11 attacks, and I really wanted to become educated. And it really took me a few years, and I grew up in this. It took me a few years to really say, okay, I feel prepared now that we can handle a lot of things. And so it's not something that's done overnight, and I'm sure your listeners, many of them are probably great preppers, and some are maybe beginners. But most of the time, for most people, it starts with food and water, and it should. And everybody's got different beliefs about how much food and, how much water and how you should do it. I'll give you my take just quickly. In terms of food, I recommend for most emergencies, for just commonplace emergencies from, hurricanes to earthquakes to whatever, that people store 30 days of non-perishable food. I think for a conflict like this, which is a high-impact, low-frequency kind of event, people might want to triple that. You might want to have 3 months of food on hand, and I think that's plenty to withstand this kind of event that were to occur. Water's a little bit trickier. You can store 3 months of water, but it's difficult. You have to have very large tanks and stuff to do that. So what I recommend typically is that people store about 28 gallons of water per person, and usually you do that in a polyethylene tank in the garage or in the closet, something like that. Again, in this case, you might want to double or triple that. Just in case water were to be lost, you would certainly be thankful that you had it. I also like the idea of having, a dozen big cases of bottled water around, just because it's much easier to drink and get to instead of having to work with your tank. And then finally, for water, you really have to have a good quality water purifier that you can go out and use to retrieve water in case your supplies are starting to get low. So just in terms of food and water, that's sort of where most people start. And there are many other, needs and emergencies. I sort of outline 13 needs in the book, and I talk about how you would prepare for each of those to be a little bit better prepared for these impacts. One that people think of right away, of course, is protection, and I think that's fine. So, a lot of preppers, myself included, are big gun buffs, and so we have our AR-15s and shotguns and all these other things to protect ourselves and our families, and I think that's great, and I think it's important. But I don't necessarily think that preparedness starts with protection. I think it's one of probably top 3 tenets that you build on, because you have to be able to eat, right? And you have to be able to be hydrated as well. So protection certainly folds in there in the top few. The last one I might throw in is that, you need some kind of emergency fund. You need some kind of the absolute, things are going bad. You have some kind of money that you can get on the road with, that if you have to buy services or some kind of emergency supplies, you can. I think you have to have that relatively handy so that you can get it at a moment's notice and go. So, there's a long list of things, but that's sort of a few I think that are important.
Your book, you've mentioned your handbook a couple of times, and my son actually gave me a hardbound copy for a present recently, and I read it cover to cover with great interest. I think a lot of our viewers who haven't had a chance should try that, because it is a very even-handed and thorough and well thought out, well organized, easily accessible book that not only lays out these topics in a very orderly manner, but also examines kind of the fundamentals and gives you kind of a level set of what the actual risk is, what your range of options are in each of these areas, what different considerations and techniques you should employ, or what the cost and effectiveness trade-offs are between them. It's just a very consumable treatise on a wide range of preparedness topics. If people want to get a hold of more of your work, find out about your newsletter and so on, where can they find your work?
Yeah, they can find all of my books on Amazon. If you just search my name, Arthur Bradley, they'll all pop up. You can also find my books, and you can sign up for the free newsletter on my website. It's disasterpreparer.com, and you can find out there's some free information on there as well about preparing and that sort of thing. So I invite your listeners to go there and check it out.
Well, Dr. Arthur T. Bradley, founder and author on disasterpreparer.com, author of over 14 books on the post-collapse and prevention of impact on your family, including the Handbook for Practical Disaster Preparedness for the Family. We always appreciate you joining us on Reluctant Preppers, and ask people to just go ahead and check out your latest article in more detail about the potential threat that's more of a clear and present danger now from this geopolitical stress that we seem to be under, and make sure that by the time they start to take action, they won't feel completely unprepared for whatever unpredictable events may be coming our way. So just thank you for being here on our corner once again on Reluctant Preppers.
All right, thank you very much.